part, as I've mentioned, is about global shocks and how they have an adverse or could have an adverse effects on globalization, on development, I'm sorry. So we've been talking about globalization and its different dimensions and its different facets and how we can measure it. And we had a look at multiple developmental impact that globalization could have, starting from just economic growth, moving on to all the other dimensions that we spoke about last time, to impacts on inequalities, on poverty, on gender issues, on human rights, and so on. Yeah. So there's the other part of it, how when the whole world is connected, it also means that if a shock happens somewhere in the world, it can also have a negative impact on other parts of the world. Yeah, so as there are also lots of positive impacts, and we had a balanced discussion so far. Yes, positive impacts, but we also talked about possible negative impacts of globalization. But definitely there is a very specific part in this negative impact, that when a crisis happens somewhere, it doesn't only affect the country where it happens, but as the world is globalized, you also have the crisis effect spilling over and spreading across the world. Yeah. And today I would like to finish off this chapter by talking about that part, by bringing in some examples from recent history or from the current timings that we're facing, yeah, and discuss with you how this has an impact on development, how this has an impact on the progress in development that happen in some countries, or the issue of eradicating poverty, or rather not, how this is having different impacts, similar and also different ones in developed and developing countries. So having said that, and before I share the slides, I would like first to listen to you and ask you, can you think of some examples of global shocks, either now or maybe in recent history, or maybe during your lifetime? So let's have a look at maybe also during maybe the past 20 years, if you can think of some examples here. Dominic?
Yeah, of course, like recently, the COVID-19 pandemic, because like it was like a shock for all supply chains, but also like for all economies, and the finance crisis 2009.
Okay, so the financial crisis in 2009, yes. So we need to discuss about that. That's already a few years ago, but now the pandemic and the last 2 years and their diverse impacts on development. So that's another thing we would need to discuss. Yeah. So let's maybe collect some examples and then get into the discussion. Syrian, am I right with the pronunciation?
Yeah. I think like one of the global pandemic was the 9/11 terrorism, which happened. And I think this rose like the whole world's attention on terrorism and its seriousness. And yeah.
Okay. Further examples you can think of? So basically an incident or a situation or a crisis that happens somewhere in the world and has its impact on also other parts of the world. So has a global impact that could affect the development, particularly of other countries. So examples that go in that direction. Johan?
Maybe just recently the Ukrainian-Russian war, because it affects many prices of natural like resources, for example, oil and gas, but as well as the agricultural sector, for example, like wheat. Yeah.
Yes, very good. So this is also happening now. So we don't only have still the pandemic effect, maybe post-pandemic effect, depending whether it's over yet or not, but now also together with the war in Ukraine, and also resulting impact out of that, and together with already the impact of the pandemic, effects are also even multiplying. So that's definitely something we need to discuss. Can you see more hands? So further examples before we get deeper into the discussion, maybe, Alexandra?
Yeah, I would also like to mention, for example, that this type of like global effect, it's not only about politics and economic, but it can also be translated to a more like social level. And in general, like social changes also have impacts and effects and can be spread out throughout the countries, changing the development course.
Okay, can you give an example of what you mean?
Yeah, for example, I don't know, like the Greta Thunberg movement on climate change, for example, or even the Me Too movement has changed, for example, gender equality and how we see it. So
Mhm.
those types of social changes have also changed every country.
Mhm. Okay, and spill over from the ideas or the movements go across borders and yeah, okay. So not necessary here adverse effects that you're talking about or shocks, but you're talking also about stimulus maybe that's coming from other parts of the world and spreading to other countries. Okay, yes. Dominic again?
Another example could also be like the trade war between China and the US,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yes.
also affects like all companies which are like European or Chinese or Vietnamese, which are like based in the US or in China.
So yes, the situation that we've been having for several years and affecting also countries' instances when it comes to international trade, when it comes to being more open or not, when it comes to maybe sometimes having to take sides for strategic reasons or for partnership reasons or being forced to do, especially developing countries that usually have lower bargaining powers and have also more dependency maybe on their corporations and relationship with developed countries. Yes. So these are plenty of examples here where you see that incidences that happen actually completely somewhere else could definitely have their multiplier effects and domino effects across the world. Some may be smaller, some bigger, some just regional, some really global. And of course, some of the examples that you've mentioned are more crucial in terms of their development adverse impact or maybe stopping the development process in many developing countries, making it more difficult to deal with issues that are already present, like the eradicating poverty and setting more development in progress in different countries, things that we've talked about, like achieving the sustainable development goals, which were already especially in their poverty target, super ambitious. So remember the recording that you had about the sustainable development goals and how reaching the zero poverty target is already something that cannot be achieved already before the incidences like the pandemic and the current conflict and its pricing effects and so on that we're having, but now is even much, much more difficult to achieve. Okay, Nico, is it also another example that you want to mention? Yes, please.
I was also thinking about something like the announcement of the first iPhone in 2007, because it was like the beginning of the, I would call, smartphone era. So that changed also a lot. A lot of companies were adapting and trying to yeah, produce like similar products and like keep up with Apple.
Okay, so not necessarily again a crisis or a negative situation that you mentioned, but again something that had its impact across different countries in the competition, but also shaped very much how business is done. Shaped very much possibilities even in the developing countries, because when, of course, at the beginning having a smartphone was a very expensive thing and being connected to the internet constantly was an expensive thing, but nowadays it makes many people also in rural areas in developing countries that maybe were not connected through regular telephones, being more connected, and it's possible to have much more services actually through e-services that were not maybe accessible before, or possible before, or too costly before, and so on. So even this, maybe a little bit later, maybe not at the very beginning, but maybe with some years later, there started to be also some apps that even are catering for some development aspects. For example, paying online for certain services, or doing transfers, making small transfers so people don't need to travel anymore for a small transfers, that they can pay cash online, and so on. So also this had a impact in even poor developing countries. Yes, okay. Who's that? Joy?
Yeah. So I'm not sure like the after effect of it is like fully realized yet, but there was like the container shortage. So I think like that like made like a lot of businesses and companies around the world like rethink um their like shipping processes and things like that, and like figuring out ways to like get things across the world instead of waiting for containers to come back and things like that.
So because there was, you mean because of disruptions in supply chains, or because of
Yes.
higher transportation prices, or slower services of international shipping? That's what you mean, or what
Slower
exactly?
services of international shipping, and like
Mhm,
the Suez Canal like thing
mhm.
that blocked that. So like that
The,
had a
the
lot
ship,
of like
the
delays.
Evergreen, that was blocking the canal
Yeah.
for some time. Of course, all this has its multipliers, but you can imagine that. So you can imagine that some of those um, shocks, like for example the Suez Canal thing, so there was the ship, and it was blocking the canal, and it stopped many ships, and it made shortages in deliveries, and had of course its impact for some time afterwards. But of course some of those examples have a little bit of a temporary effect, or maybe a short run effect, versus other examples that we've mentioned. They really had an effect for the years after, and maybe will are still going to have some effects in the future. So we can definitely categorize those effects, of course, in the positive ones, and rather the negative ones that have adverse effects, in some that are having big impact or smaller impact, just short term or shorter and long term impact more regional, more global, and so on. So because we don't want to stay at the superficial, shallow level, let's pick up some of those examples and try to do some deeper uh, discussion about what exactly are the impacts here, and discuss about that, while taking into account the everything that we've learned in class so far, like our understanding of development in its multidimensional setting, our understanding of how the world is already developing in achieving the development goals, or not achieving the sustainable development goals, or maybe not achieving them, on how there are differences between different countries according to their development progress and development status, and so on. Yeah, so let's pick up some of those examples. Let's maybe start very temporary, and talk about the current conflict and the current war in Ukraine, and specifically about the strong increase that we're currently having in food prices. Okay, so this is not something new. This happened before. I don't know if you have experienced or heard about this, but there was actually already in 2008, 2000, no, 2007, 2008, there was actually already a food crisis before. So there was a very strong increase in food prices before, for several reasons. So, I mean, the oil prices are very volatile. So back then there was a sharp increase in oil prices. There was a super strong demand on biofuel. So using the food more for energy and made it less available for nutrition. Basically, there were also some trade shocks in food markets, which made disruptions in or made a mismatch between supply and demand, which led to the fact that there was also strong or sharp increase in food prices. Now we're seeing this again as resulting from the current war situation, and even in a much more sharper way. So, what do you think? How would this maybe have an impact on development of, or how does this have an impact on different countries, developed and developing countries? And is the impact rather just a regional impact, or is it more of a global impact? Alexandra?
Yeah, well, of course it has an impact because like the higher the prices, the more money you need, and that obviously limits your opportunities and possibilities. And for example, and now talking about Mexico, the president of Mexico implemented like this plan in order for the top 50 companies in Mexico to kind of like help stop inflation. But that means that in a way they're going to be subsidizing their products for the next 6 months. So for the consumers, it's basically good because now right now inflation is above 7% in Mexico, which is a lot. And like the majority of the people are poor, but that means that also that money, instead of being invested in development, in creating new things and so on, needs to be invested in order to contain and control inflation, so that the majority of the people, like we're talking about 70% of people, can still eat at least the main the main food that you can find in Mexico.
Okay. Okay, so you're talking specifically about inflation effect and inflation getting strongly out of control, and any policies that try to stop it would be at the cost of other needed investments by governments as well. Okay, let's collect further arguments from others. Fidelia, please.
Yeah. I think inflation would be a lot more obvious in developing countries than developed countries. That's how I think. Because of the pandemic, the economic has been really stagnate. Like there's no movement whatsoever, especially with developing countries that a lot of people have, or the economic are big in informal sector rather than the formal sector. And with the inflation, it really hit them quite hard, especially back in Indonesia. There was a time where the price of palm oil, which is the oil that we use to cook, is really high, and a lot of people who's obviously in informal sectors can't buy it or couldn't buy it because of the high prices, and the government had to control it whatsoever. So I feel like with the inflation right now, it's probably gonna hit regional first and then global, depending how hard the country is hit by the pandemic. And
But what I meant by region is actually the region where the conflict started. And
okay, okay.
global, I meant in completely other regions of the world. So if you speak
Okay.
about Indonesia, that's not where the conflict is, but they are feeling the impact. So
Right,
that
right.
would be rather global, huh?
Yes, yes. So in that
Yeah.
case, yes, it is
Mhm.
global, I guess.
Okay, so increase in very important in prices of very important food items that are crucial for everyday nutrition or everyday cooking of people in countries. And if I'm not mistaken, Indonesia also issued an order not to export any palm oil at the moment,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes. It's because of that. Yeah.
So that's a typical reactions of some countries when they feel that because of the increase of prices, there is already a problem for local people. So sometimes there start to be the issue of, okay, now we're running out of the possibility to satisfy because of supply and demand mismatch somehow to satisfy locally first before globally. So countries become more protectionist in those kind of situations, sometimes take some sort of nationalist, maybe protectionist approaches in saying, okay, let's first make sure to satisfy the own people and then cover the exports. Because the idea is the world prices are increasing strongly. Usually that's good for the exporter countries. Food exporter countries are always in a better position than food importer countries when there is a food crisis, because prices go up And it means for them more profits, because they can sell at higher prices, not just in their home countries, but also abroad. The problem is always bigger for the food importing countries because they are relying on getting the food from somewhere else in the world, okay, from other countries. Now, the problem is in some countries that are food exporters, here, like the situation with palm oil in Indonesia, now the price is going high and high. Well, that's good for the country. They can make profits from abroad. But the problem is at some point, local people cannot afford those high prices. So sometimes government makes some sort of policy that then say, okay, now first, let's make sure that we don't have a crisis locally here because of the shortage. And then if there's a surplus, we can still do the exports. Meaning that somewhere else, countries that were basically relying on getting the palm oil from Indonesia, they won't be able to be satisfied. At that level, but not just here. Of course, originally the problem is actually that the conflict area, so Russia and Ukraine, were actually exporting lots of food items to the world, especially the wheat, especially vegetable oils, and so on. So this made basically shortage in those items and increase of prices. So people go to other possibilities. For example, palm oil. So it means much higher demand for palm oil export. It's good for them, but then is, okay, what about the own people? And then come from many parts of the world some sort of protective, anti-global, if you want. So an anti-global movement. Policies, less economic globalization. Remember, we said economic globalization means the countries are open, less tariffs, less quotas, borders are open, and export and import happen more freely. But what is happening is exactly anti-movement, more shutting borders, stopping exports, putting higher tariffs, and saying, well, now we have a crisis situation, so let's act locally first. Also, some other countries say, okay, no, now we cannot export wheat because we want to first make sure that we have locally sufficient food for the own population and so on. So you see implications here are not just happening locally where the conflict is happening, but can easily actually spread globally and have their multiplier effects. What other effects can you think of the food prices and the crisis and the basically sharp increase of food prices? Or how would you, Fidelia already gave us some arguments from her point of view about it. What do you think about the impact on developing versus developed countries here? Johan?
Yeah, in developed countries, people basically will change their consuming behavior. Means they might go less to do more like expensive things, going to restaurants or going to cinema or something. But for example, in the developing countries, it's not just that people change their consuming behavior, but it means that they maybe do not have calorie surplus anymore and are not able to feed themselves. So maybe they will also lack productivity and will also it will impact the money they can spend on education, and it will impact their ability to work and so on and so forth.
Exactly. So the question that we need to think about here is, for example, if we have food price issue here, so how much percentage-wise do people spend on food in different parts of the world, or depending on their monthly budget? This percentage is very different. So in some households and in poorer countries, maybe food consumption could make up to 70-80% of their monthly budget. So then the impact is definitely more severe. And as Johan was describing it, there's definitely less room for changing priorities and saying, okay, less spending on luxurious things and more spending on the necessary food items. Versus if in other parts of the world, maybe spending on food, it makes 20-30% of people budgets. And I'm going to show you statistics really about the percentage that is spent on food items depending on the income group. Then there is more room to say, okay, there's going to be less spend on that or that or that category to accommodate the higher food prices. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, okay, what are other necessary things than just food? And definitely health, education, proper nutrition, not just any food, but also healthy food and proper nutrition is important here. So definitely the need to spend more on necessary food expenses comes also at the cost of others, also necessary expenses, like education, like health. And as we spoke before, these are issues where already many developing countries are actually struggling and are not doing very well. So if you think of development impact, the setback on development does not only come from the fact that people cannot pay those higher prices easily, but that they have to take from other budgets, from other spendings, which are already not very much. I mean, already we have little spendings on education and little spending on healthcare. We already have poor quantity and quality. So all of this is going basically to have an adverse impact and be adversely basically affected by the higher food prices as multiplier effects. So the impact on development will not just be on food, but also quality of nutrition, quality and quantity of education, quality and quantity of healthcare. And the pressure is not only on government and on individual budgets of people, but also on government budgets. Because if governments need to step in and do some subsidies and help out and try to limit the inflation and do this and do that, and subsidize food maybe in order to make it available, well, they don't have endless budgets. And this is going also to be at the cost of their percentage on spending on education and healthcare and so on. So the stress will not be, and the pressure will not just be on households' budget, but also on government budget, which are already in developing countries under much stronger pressure and are not already, capture or taking care of the situation properly. There were already development challenges and development problems, and basically now they can very much get magnified. And being a global problem makes it more difficult to help each other as countries. Because everyone is in a difficult situation somehow, versus if a problem just happened in one part of the world, there can be more solidarity and there can be more attention, there can more help, but the situation is happening everywhere, or the impact is happening everywhere. Also pressure on budgets of international organizations, because it's not only that there's just a small region in the world that's having those adverse effects, but it's actually in many parts of the world. So this is the problem that is common with many global problems, and we can see it very much in the example of the food crisis. So let me share now the slides with you. Let me, yeah. So now it's good, right? Just one. Okay, so the first example of the global shocks and their adverse impacts is basically here the food crisis. And there was one already, as I said, 2007, 2008. Maybe you have forgot about it, but it's actually happening again now. So before I talk about the details, let me show you that graph here, which tells you this is here months. So that's months of different years, January, February, March, April, May, and so on until December. So 12 months of the year. And you can see because prices of food are often seasonal. So there are usually seasons where there's the harvest, prices are higher, prices are lower in some seasons. So it's often making more sense if you compare prices between years, that you compare prices, let's say, of March in the year 2019 with March 2020, with March 21, with March 22. So it's the same month of the year, then just comparing just the year average. So you can see in 2019 here, for example, there was that was the price level of food. So you can see towards the end of 2019, there was a little bit of an increase of the food price level. But okay, maybe that's also the winter effect in December. Well, the pandemic effect actually rather hit in 2020. Yeah, but then you can immediately here see that at some point in the year 2020, here there was a sharper increase in the food prices. Yeah, and you can see definitely that in the second half of 2020, the price level was definitely higher than in 2019. Yeah, but then in 2021, you see the entire graph is a much, much, much higher level than it was in the 2 years before. So we were already having increase here of food prices strongly happening in the year 2021, but 2022 is a completely different caliber. So now you see here the red curve, and it stops here in March because the data is of March um, 2022, when actually the food price levels were higher than ever in the decades before. So, and you can see that also, it's not only that the prices are increasing, but also there was such a sharp here increase already since just the beginning of the year 2022 and the situation in March. And it's not even relaxing at the moment. So this is really very sharp increase. And what is here 2014 to 2016? If you're wondering, basically they are comparing the price level with 2014 to 2016. So this is basically the 100 or the so if the price level of 2014 to 2016 is 100, and here in March 22 we are 160, basically it's 60% higher than it used to be in 2014 to 2016. So compared to 2014 to 2016 here, the 2019, 2020 were fine apart from the end of 2020, but then you see 2021, 2022, how much, much sharper here the price increase is. So if we go back here, we can say that the global food prices reached their highest level in March 2022. The data shows us that the food commodity prices increased by a third compared to the previous year. So just compared to 2021, which was already higher, there is already 1/3 increase, which is a lot. If you compare to the year before, it's much, much higher. And the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has added to wider already the post-pandemic price growth that was there. So before this conflict started, there were already disruptions in some supply chains. There were already pandemic effects felt, maybe not just in food. I mean, there was in many businesses, many electronic spare parts, microchips shortages, car parts shortages, and so on. So it's not only the food sector here, but economically, there was the situation of high prices, but also lots of stagnation in many countries of the world. And that's why we hear now, usually if there is inflation, the economy is overheating. But nowadays, you hear, maybe you heard the term stagnation. So you have a stagflation, I'm sorry. So it's a mix of having stagnation and inflation, which is economically not a typical scenario at all. So usually having a stagnated economy is exactly the opposite of having inflation. But now you have both. You have economically, the economy is not doing well, and it's more stagnation, and there are less investments, and there are lower job opportunities, more unemployment, and so on. But on the other hand, price levels are super high. So this makes also policy difficult here, because usually when there is inflation, you would like to have policies that make the economy stop a little bit in order to reduce price levels again, have less inflation, increased interest rates, for example, then there are lower investments. But the problem is now with increases of interest rate that we're seeing across the world, what happens basically is also there's going to be less investments, but already the economies are not in a good situation. So this would make probably this situation even less longer. Now, going back again to talking specifically about the food prices, all of these aspects together led basically to the Food Global Community prices. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, they are saying that in March of this year, 2022, they hit an all-time high. Yeah, the food prices, which is here what we see in March 2022. If we look at already the origin of the problem here with the conflict, with the war in Ukraine, actually Russia, and this should be Russia, not Russian, Russia and Ukraine combined are already, or used to be, supplying the world with 30% of global wheat exports. So 30% of wheat that was exported in the world, or 30% of the world's supply of wheat that was used in other countries, were originating from Russia and Ukraine. And you see already a major issue here. So this is basically not available. Yeah, and also 1/5 of the world's maize. And this already led to a huge increase in their prices, and in not just the price, but the price increase comes from what? The price increase comes from a supply shortage. So there is not enough, so then there's scarcity, prices increase. So the shortages of these, and also other commodities, because there have been already issues in global supply chains. It's not just food, and it's not just the maize, and not just the wheat, but many other issues. And also the vegetable oils and so on led to very much increase of the food prices. Now, staple goods like grains, vegetable oils, and so on were also among the worst affected foodstuff. So all this, in addition to increase of living expenses from, for example, the increasing energy prices. So it's not only those prices that increase, but what about the oil prices? The oil price increased very much, which made international transportation more expensive, shipping more expensive, energy prices for heating and so on more expenses, which affect households, everything. So this had, again, its multiplier effect. The already existing, depending on how you see it, pandemic, post-pandemic effects that were already also leading to lots of price increases. So all of this together are making the impact much stronger. So all in all, rising inflations across the world, there's barely a country who's not having inflation, different effects, different levels. Yes, in some countries more than others, yes, but this is a global effect. And if we look at how it hits different countries, so if you look, for example, I'll go back to this, but if you look at this map, table, that's what we've been talking about a few minutes ago. So basically, if you just look at the food prices, at the food expenses and what is their share by different income groups. So there are statistics basically here and calculations from various sources that saying in low income countries and low income people, you see there is much more higher share of their monthly expenses being spent, almost half spent on food, and just on food, versus when we talk here about high income people, but also high income countries, developed countries, where this is just 15% of people spending. So this is exactly what we've been speaking about, that when the share spent on food, think about your own budget every month. How much do you spend on food? So if food prices become more expensive, maybe you can spend a bit less on other things and still manage your budget, that you can still accommodate your necessary needs. But if food is really a huge part of your monthly budget and everything becomes more expensive, this is more severe. Now, the issue is it's not just food prices that got higher, because we just mentioned that also other prices got higher. Living costs in general got higher. High energy prices got higher. And other expenses are more costly now. It is not just the food. So then all this combined is definitely making a very adverse effect on development. So if we try to think about the effect at all times, not just now, but when it was also in the food crisis that happened before, more maybe 1.5 decades ago, it entails definitely a setback in the development progress, and the impact is definitely much stronger felt in poorer and in developing countries than in developed countries. Already, if you think about vulnerability, so if you have less savings, if you have less backups, if you're not insured, if the informal sector is larger, so it's easier for people just to be laid off, to get laid off compared to having a safe and stable job. Also, when the informal sector is higher, remember we mentioned this also affects government budgets. So huge informal sector means that informal sector doesn't pay any taxes to government. So this affects government revenues that they can actually spend on dealing with crisis, on education, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on everything where government should actually be taking part in. But this basically means when this is already under pressure and already not doing well, as it is in many developing countries, then any crisis already magnifies already existing problems. Add to this that institutions are less efficient, there is poor governance and there is more corruption. All of this. There is less, for example, usually developed countries have institutions, have authorities that make sure that there is competition in the different sectors, that there is no monopoly power in the different sectors. But these institutions are much less in developing countries. So it's much easier for also suppliers and sellers and so on to also misuse the situation and even increase prices even more, have more monopoly power and so on, and always blame it on the international crisis. So all of this together magnifies the situation. But if we try to disentangle the effects a little bit, on the one hand, we can say, the immediate effect, since we're talking about food here, is that the number of people that suffers from hunger, not just hunger, but also undernourishment and malnourishment, is getting higher. With the increase of price levels of food, especially for low-income households, this means that maybe there is a lower quality of food that they're going to consume. If they try to just maintain a minimum level of calories and just keep the family fed, while taking into account that everything is more expensive, there is a high probability that they're going to be spending more on lower quality food and then less nutritious food, which would also increase issues of malnutrition. And this specifically is also of big effects on the development of children, for example. And we know that developing countries, poorer countries already are having more population growth, so more children to feed. So again, the magnified effects here. The fact that food expenditure, as we said, contribute to a much higher percentage of the budget for very poor family, the poorest, it can even be 80% of their budget. Families that just lived exactly at the subsistence level, this basically means they suffer much more from the inflation effect. If the overall price level is increasing strongly and they are already vulnerable in the informal sector, no stable jobs, and so on, this makes them also feel that inflation effect definitely much, much more. As we've said, the impact is not just on the food sector, but also on the other sectors, on other necessary expenses and other necessary investments. So higher food expenditure basically stresses the households of the budgets of the poor households very much, which means they're going to be having to spend less on other necessary things like education, like health, and you can see now the direct negative development impact here. And that effect is not a short-term effect. When people invest less in health and education, the negative effect out of this is long-lasting. And again, it was already, the situation before was bad already, not good. So it means it can get worse. Now add to this, again, the pandemic of the last 2 years, where already the health sector was having multiplied issues, and the education with schools closing and breakouts at school, and some countries with lockdowns, and some people losing their jobs, so already reducing investments in this situation, government budgets were already under pressure, and all of this. So the situation was already tough for 2 years at least, and now add to this again the additional crisis situation that is happening here. So a problem for households, a problem for governments, and a problem for international organizations. Yeah. So the population of the countries that have the population definitely of the countries that have been, as we've mentioned, more food importers. So they are relying on importing the food from other countries. And the countries, there are some countries that used to be dependent very much on food aid. They were already importing food, but they cannot even finance properly the importation of food that they are doing. They were really hit hardest by those rising prices. Countries that were already struggling due to other issues, like for example, Lebanon is one of the countries that is now hit very much, is not the poorest of the world, but they have been already having governmental crisis, political crisis, stability crisis, inflation crisis, currency crisis, many things already exacerbated by the pandemic. And then now with the increase of oil prices, and so what happens, lots of electricity cut and shortages. They are importers of wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and it's a country where the food habits are strongly relying on wheat. Bread is very important for the people. This is another thing. If you think of societies like in Asia, where people are eating more rice than wheat, then they're less affected. But countries that are more dependent on wheat, they are more affected, because when you think about inflation, it has to do with what is your representative consumption pattern. What is the representative basket of goods and services that people are spending on? So everyone is buying lots of wheat items because it's a typical consumption pattern in the country, then usually they are more affected. If the countries are importing that, they're more affected. If they've been already struggling and relying on lots of aid because they are already in a very tough situation, and the reason for that situation, that's another thing. So is it because of their bad institutions, or because of corruption, or because of conflicts or wars, or that's another thing. Okay, but the situation as is, when it was already tough, it is getting even more multiplied with that rising prices and the global supply shortages. So, as you already mentioned in your argument, several governments implemented and are now implementing, on the one hand, protective measures, like what we've mentioned with Indonesia, saying, okay, no, it's not allowed to export certain items because we need first to apply or satisfy the local people. Other governments making subsidy programs by basically saying, okay, we will only tolerate or make the people pay the price increase up to a certain level. The rest, we're going basically to bridge. We're going to step in and say, okay, we will make the bread maximum price, let's say, increase by 20%, but not more, because people will not be able to afford it. The rest, we're basically going to subsidize. Some countries are already having wheat subsidies, like in Egypt, for example. There's a strong program already of subsidizing bread. Now the government budget is under much, much more pressure, because subsidy always means if you want your people to have it for price X, but the global price is Y, So you're basically paying the difference as a government, y minus x. But if the world price, y, is increasing and increasing and increasing, and you want to keep the price for your people the same, then basically the gap that you have to subsidize as the government is getting wider and wider and wider, more and more. Yeah? So countries that are already subsidizing wheat, like in Egypt, countries that are already subsidizing oil, like in Egypt, are having this big pressure in addition to already existing economic problems that are there. So already existing problems are just getting magnified in those situations. Yeah, and in countries that are even poorer, the situation is even much more severe. So those subsidy programs are basically putting strong pressure on governments' budgets, and poor countries already have a small budget. They are already not having lots of government revenues. One of the reasons is also the huge informal sector, but also the small size of the economy, the inefficiencies, the lacking industries, and. So those kind of pressures on the small budgets of governments poor governments are even becoming stronger. Not just the people's budgets and not just the government's budgets, but even international organizations. All the organizations that are engaged in food aid, they are under strong pressure. Because as I told you, if this problem is just in some part of the world, then they can concentrate the aid in this part. But when the effect now is global in many parts of the world, yeah, this puts a serious pressure on budgets of food aid organizations and actually threatens somehow the maintenance of that help, because they need to help in several parts of the world, and this makes the help only be limited for the different parts of the world, or possible to be only a small part. If we look at how it was with the last food crisis in 2008, what happens is actually there were in many countries, people went on the street, there were hunger roads in reportedly more than 30 countries now, where people were in a very extreme situation and even went on the streets because of these issues. So we yet have to see how the things were developed, but it's a very serious situation, and it's definitely a strong development setback. If you consider already how the last 2 years have been, if you consider that we're already far from reaching certain development goals like the poverty, zero poverty goal and so on, then the situation is here definitely even getting more severe. So any questions to that, or anything you would like to add? We already talked about this one here, that you would like to add to that? Any further arguments you maybe would like to add to that? Okay, so another crisis that happened just in one country and then spread to other countries from relatively recent history that you already mentioned also in the brainstorming was definitely the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Yeah, so it actually started in the United States. With Lehman Brothers and the mortgage prices in the United States, and the real estate market collapsing and so on. So it was basically a US local crisis. But of course, the impact was not a local one, it was a global one, and it was strongly felt even in the least developing countries. So the financial crisis became not a local one, but a world financial crisis, and had serious macroeconomic effects for also the least developing countries. So statistics say that 30% of the least developing countries were actually considered highly vulnerable to the financial crisis. And it was estimated that in 2019, the increased financing needs of the poorest countries, basically, these are the low-income countries, the least developing countries, was at least 25 billion US dollars. So definitely here, this was some downside of globalization. So because of the globalization, there was a stronger exposure to the global downturn here. If the world wasn't that globalized, the effects were just have been local. But as there are lots of positive effects of globalization, yes, sure, of course, but there is the problem that when there is a problem somewhere, it can have its adverse effects in other parts of the world, and often those adverse effects are strongly felt in developing countries. So if you think of the impact of the financial crisis for the least developing countries, so first of all, there were problems happening already in developed countries. And the situation started first in the United States, has its impact on several other developed countries, also in Europe, in Northern America, and had actually strong economic impacts in those countries. Now, this had multiplier effects then in the international companies, in the international economics sphere, in exchange markets, and so on. So first of all, when the developed countries were in crisis, they basically were importing less from other countries. So there was less demand for export of the poorest countries, which are already very low in reality in normal times. But in that situation, even less. There were also slowing down economic activities. Commodity prices were falling because the world was getting in a strong stagnation, and there is not a lot of economic activities and so on. So it meant the government revenues from taxes were already also getting lower, putting stronger pressure on government budgets. Now, foreign investments. Some of those countries have investments from foreign countries, but actually all investments across the world shrinked and decreased very sharply in the time of the financial crisis. So basically, investments from abroad were much, much lower, not just in the year of the crisis, but also the years after. So there was an adverse impact on investments on those countries. Remittances. So many poor countries have actually citizens that are working abroad, that are sending money back home to those countries. And this is our next chapter that we're going to talk about, the remittances, that we briefly mentioned in the social globalization aspect. So basically, many people in developed countries actually also lost their jobs, and in developing countries as well. So if people were sending remittances back home, what happened during the remittances time? The remittances shrinked very much because people had less surplus. It was a volatile time. There was instability. Many people lost their jobs and so on. Also, international organizations and aid flows, bilateral aid, multilateral aid, was also under pressure because also donor countries were countries that were affected strongly by the financial crisis. So if you think of developed countries as the donor countries, that were already in a crisis, so when they were considering their budgets of governments and what are they going to spend on what, there was less priority for aid to other countries because they were already strongly struggling locally. So governments, even in developed countries, had to think a lot about social policies at that time because many people were affected in these countries by the financial crisis. So we can see here a very straightforward example of how financial crisis happened completely somewhere else. But it can still have a setback on development in the poor countries in a completely other parts of the world. So the fact that the world is interconnected can bring lots of benefits, yes, but definitely it also means that there is also some vulnerability coming from global and international shocks, and these are usually more felt in countries that are already more vulnerable because they are already having a weaker structure, they already have weaker institutions, more pressure on government budgets, and so on. So these are here a few examples of that. I mean, definitely, you already mentioned the pandemic. So the question, how far is also the pandemic used to be also a global shock for poverty and development. So let me maybe here stop sharing and get back to you and ask you, how far do you think also we can consider the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, also a situation of global shock that had its adverse effects on the development of developing countries? What do you think? Iber?
I think it's very big. I just wanted to mention a recent example. For example, in Sri Lanka, there's a big riot right now that is happening due to the loss of electricity for like more than 36 hours, and they were already politically unstable, but due to the pandemic that is happening, the shortage of energy, and also the price of oil being so high, led to a big riot that I think I heard today the people have to put what is it? The people what is it? Put fire on the assembly's house. So there was a big fire that happened, and
Yeah.
so we can see that like if this keeps going, of course, like now most things are going back to normal, but I think the impact that the pandemic have will be much longer. And also with the pandemic, like people who got corona, there is a longer what is it, disabilities they face, so the manpower also is going to be decreased, and there is a need for a lot of like sustainable welfare. But if you are in developing countries and you already have COVID, but there's a longer staying disabilities you have due to COVID, would the government be able to afford covering covering welfare for these new people who are disabled? I don't know. That could also lead to a more problem in those countries, especially in the health side of the market, I think.
Okay, let's collect more arguments from others. Jihyun?
Okay, so obviously in terms of like flights, so like traveling and also airlines, they had a very hard time in terms of their business because all countries stopped like traveling and people were not allowed to go around other countries. And for leisure, of course, they might go and travel, but also some people were having difficulties because they had to go to other countries for business purposes, but actually they couldn't. So it also led to like damage in business fields. So I think it really greatly affects economic side.
Yeah, so economic effects when there was disruptions of travelings, when there were not the possibility for some people even to go back to their home countries. We had it mentioned also earlier, the disruptions that we're having in supply chains, which are affecting businesses strongly, which are affecting investments strongly, are shortages of certain items, increase of prices of certain items. So the effects are definitely not just health effects. So of course there are also immediate health effects by people that are that were affected health-wise by by COVID-19, and some also having long COVID and having longer term effects. Some people being health-wise more vulnerable, and so on. But this is one side of it. But then there are also, of course, other, not only health sides, even in the health side, there are also the effect that when there were maybe hospitals being had to shut down and only be concentrating on COVID-19 patients. So there were longer lines, waiting lines, maybe for people that are having other diseases. Yeah, there were often also needed surgeries for cancer patients, for example, other patients that were set back and were pushed back because of the situation, because of risks of getting infected, but also because the health personnel The health staff and the doctor and the nurses were under lots of pressure, and also some of them fall sick in many countries. So the whole health system was also under pressure. Okay, so these are secondary health effects, but all in all, the effects were not just in the health sector, but definitely also felt in economics, in education, in so many other things. So give me more maybe examples. Fidelia?
Yeah, one example that I can think of would probably the increase in inequality, maybe economically. The things like when the pandemic hit, we, at least a lot of people were able to work from home, right? Imagine if the for the blue collar jobs worker, they were not able to work from home. So with everything that was on lockdown, they basically don't get money. They don't earn any money. So I think in that sense, it could increase the inequality just within the country itself. So that's one of the example that I could think of.
Definitely, huh? So there was a lot of big difference between those that were able to work remotely and work online and jobs that where it was not able. So that's one line. Another thing, again, informal and formal sector. So people in the formal sector, their jobs were secured, even if some people were let go and laid off, but it doesn't happen from one day to the other. So usually they have a notice, they have some time, whereas people working informally, often it was just next day, you're not needed anymore. And business were shutting down, restaurants were shutting down, or letting go of people because they barely have people coming, so they don't need maybe people to work in the kitchen as much, or waiters and so on. Entertainment industry in general, airports, tourism sector. Usually have also lots of informal workers, but it was actually affecting formal and informal workers in that sector, but the informal even more because the effect was immediate. But even the formal worker, at some time, they were also maybe they are still hired 2-3 months because of having a notice, maybe just 1 month, but then also many were actually let go. So there was again here the inequality because widening because people that are already more vulnerable were strongly affected or were affected more by that by the pandemic effect. Yeah. Also, if you think about education, there's lots of talk now about also the inequality of opportunities widening in the education sector, because kids had to learn from home. Of course, online learning at universities as well, but that's a different situation. But when kids had to be in front of the computers at home, again, it means they need to have the infrastructure for this. They need to have the parents supervising this. So when the parents have to work, there is a problem here. Families that have more children, there's a problem here. Parents needed to have also the computers and one computer for every child. And you needed the school to be also in having the infrastructure for this. You needed the teacher to be able to do this. So some countries were able to accommodate that situations better than others, but also within countries, you definitely had those that are in the better schools and in the more advanced regions and in the already more in families that are already better educated and already more affluent, having a better situation. When there was also more relying on parents to teach the children rather than teachers, because the parents need to follow up at school with the school work because remote learning is not easy for a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year old at home. Sometimes school was just once a week or twice a week, so more relying on the parents to do this. So of course, there is a path dependency here. Parents that are already more educated, parents that can help better are in a completely different situation than parents who are themselves having very little education or are illiterate to begin with, or not available at all because of the remote working, or risking to infect the children, and so on. So all of this is also widening the situation of in unequal opportunities here. So you see the impact is not just the health sector, not just directly and indirectly, but economics, jobs, education, widening gaps, And some of the effects are not just short term, but are often but are also having multiplier effects. So there's also lots of talk in the education sector. Those 2 years, it's often said that some children basically learned almost nothing for 2 years. And this is definitely going to affect the learning in the next years, unless there is some sort of catching up of this gap, and is definitely having long-term effects also on human capital. So all of this combined is also setting lots of or making lots of setback in the development progress that has been happening in the years before. And as you can see here with all the examples that we've mentioning, countries that are already struggling, countries that are already in a worse situation and have worse institutions and have less capable governments and have already more conflicts and more issues and are already struggling in their normal situation, these are already the countries that do much worse in the crisis. Because they are already struggling with the normal case. So they can't tolerate even, a crisis situation if they are already not handling the normal situation properly, if you want. So in that sense, then they are affected more by things like financial crisis, like food crisis, like the pandemic, because they are already struggling with the normal situation and already having lots of development problems and challenges, lots of homework already to do, lots of issues to solve, lots of wrong patterns and challenges that are already slowing down their development process completely. And this, or for example, already existing conflicts that are not solved. And all those issues can just get magnified and exacerbated when there are certain global crises, like all the examples that we've mentioned today. Okay, so any questions, comments from your side? Anything to add? Okay, so basically this is now the end of the big globalization chapter that we talked about for several weeks, where we already had a good overview about what is globalization, its different dimensions, how can we measure it, different effects of globalization on different development aspects. We looked at many literature results, also empirical ones in that regard, and at the end also talked about global shocks. What we're going to do next is basically take some important globalization aspects specifically and dig a little bit deeper into. So now we have already a very good overview about globalization in general and about development in general from our previous chapters. What we're going to do next is just pick up topics like, for example, remittances, and learn in more detail about it, and then discuss its development impacts. So do remittances enhance economic development or not? So we're going to discuss that, but first we need to look a little bit about what are remittances, what are the variables here and so on. And then in a later chapter, we will talk about foreign direct investment, a very important topic also in the field of globalization. So we're going to understand a lot about how does it work, what do those international companies do, and so on. And then also ask the questions, is FDI something that boosts economic development of countries? What are, again, always a balanced discussions, pros and cons always, in order to learn more about those topics. All topics we already included a little bit in our discussion before, especially when we talked about the different elements of the globalization index, right? But we haven't spoken in details about, and for every aspect of globalization, there is actually separate literature and lots of insights, theoretical and empirical literature about the topic. So we're going to have now, for the remaining parts of this class in this semester, some selective topic of globalization that we're going to dig a little bit deeper into and discuss about. Okay, so before we do this, let's take a break. So 10 minutes and then we'll reconvene. See you then.